Oh, let's get into this next one. Let me preface this a little bit because um, while these topics are challenging, we do have one particular tool that is in our tool belt, which is somehow or another, students come into our classrooms knowing just a little bit about the civil rights movement. They don't always know the details. They don't always know, for example, how important Bayard Rustin or how important Ella Baker was, but they certainly have some sort of historical consciousness about the importance of the 1950s and 60s. Maybe it's because of what we do every February, but we do at least have the notion that students come to classes knowing something about civil rights movement, protests, and all that. And as much as we sometimes have to deal with the same stories and same narratives with that, it does provide an inroad. But let's get into some more questions that get us thinking about identity and thinking about some broader concepts. How does the way that we identify with the past shape our perspective? How do we, as educators, impact our own instruction? What are we bringing to the classroom that's valuable, that's useful, that's important, and how do we then work to fold that into the classroom? We oftentimes are told that we want to be unbiased, but we know that that is almost impossible. None of us are fully non-biased. Cicero, yes, we it's really important that we not run away from the vicious racism of the North. When we teach these historical topics, we are quick to blame the South. And our Northern histories tell us that at the very least with the Great Migration, along with large numbers, millions of Black people moving north, racism came north as well and was certainly there all along. Other thoughts? How do we, when
Can I,
we, go ahead, Adam, yeah.
Oh, that wasn't me.
Oh,
that was William.
go ahead, William.
I just had two comments. One, it's really getting dark at your place, Rob. It's like
I got
all
to
of a
turn some
sudden
light,
you're in the
yeah.
dark.
It's not so bad. I got a street light or two out here, so I'm okay. I turn the porch light on.
But the other is, when you talk about this with history, one of the things that, and I mentioned kindred earlier, it's really interesting that we keep revisiting that idea. I think of Octavia Butler's Kindred. There was some time ago on PBS, back when my kids were small, there was a young adult version of Kindred where a guy from the streets of some city unnamed suddenly found himself back on a plantation, and that was aimed at young people. Um, and then, of course, Haile Germina, the Ethiopian filmmaker, did Sankofa, which did follow that theme. And then, of course, now you've got a film with Janelle Monáe in it following that same theme.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting that they are working on that past and present by thrusting somebody from today's society back into the days of slavery. And they're trying to sort out the differences and perhaps even similarities, how things have changed in that. But that it's interesting to me that in the world of literature and filmmaking, that this particular historical theme keeps being revisited. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that or not.
And I'm responding to you, John. I'll just mention it. That's a really important point, William, on in a couple of ways. One, we have now with Netflix and Hulu and these other what were sort of rogue digital platforms not long ago. They've become mainstream, and while becoming mainstream, I think these other platforms have done a great job of staying true to being somewhat rogue in their approach. And so there are a number of really, really good videos on both Netflix and Hulu and other places that get into some really important historical, um, what we might call historical fiction, along with the science fiction, um, Afrofuturism. One other that I'd recommend is Mudbound on Netflix, which traverses the experiences of a Black veteran who goes back to the South. And one important thread to civil rights activism, rights based activism, has been the role of servicemen, Black servicemen in particular, in those experiences. And, you know, they come back home and they want democracy at home after having fought for democracy abroad. They are important in local movements. They are important in a whole range of ways. And so, you know, teaching about the experiences of folks who have given their lives for the country helps to get us into some of these topics as well. You know, it's hard to argue against someone who has fought for these very basic rights overseas and elsewhere, to suggest that they then come back to Jim Crow. You know, that is a really, really important way to talk about not only servicemen, but these fundamental notions around who is a citizen and citizenship more broadly. You know, John, you mentioned this. We do talk a lot about not overly privileging Father Grappi in the narrative of the open housing marches, but that's also encouraging us not to fall victim to great person, great man theorization in the classroom and around these topics. And so, as much as we uh, do raise the somewhat provocative notion of not canonizing Father Grappi, no pun intended, along in that process. Part of why we're doing so is to talk about the importance of all of the nameless other people who were so central to the successes of those campaigns. And so we don't want to diminish Father Grappi's role. We just want to make sure that other voices in those experiences are there for. Exactly, Luis. What the hell were they fighting for? Absolutely.
Yeah, John, you know, Grappi tends to be this lightning rod, and to just stay in that metaphor, when in fact the energy that created the open housing marches, as is the case with so many other movements, was distributed amongst a large group of people, and the vast majority of them being young African American people. And I think, so to me, the project of de-emphasizing Grappi, like Rob said, it isn't about unseating him, but it's about locating the power of the story where it actually happened, which I think in a lot of ways, I don't think I think the open housing marches are probably an acute version of this. I'm sure there's a lot of ways in which kind of the decentralized nature of a movement's obfuscated by the tendency just to say that guy did it. But man, I think Grappi's role in it, and the way that he has eclipsed so much of the narrative, has really hurt that story from being owned by generations of young Black people. So that's a difficult thing it is a balancing act.
You know, Vietnam is critical. I appreciate that comment, Janice, about the Vietnam era and what changes as a result of Vietnam. Vietnam also allows us to continually question uh, how folks engage in wartime efforts and then how that resonates domestically. You know, you can have a number of rights-based conversations around Vietnam, whether it's its connection to the civil rights movement as a later phase, but then also it really gets us into the way student protests play a role in that late 60s, early 70s moment as well. And for young people in particular, and why we like to focus on young people, it's so important for them to see themselves in the narrative. You know, for young people to see themselves as agents of social change. And I know that for, in some cases, empowering young people can also be threatening, you know,
Yeah.
because they might turn around 2 days later and hold a nonviolent protest in your class, you know. But, you know, we need them to find their voices. especially these days.
And yeah, I mean, you can point that out in a lot of history too, right? Like, I mean, the open housing marches being the place where we focused. And we said this in our last talk. The NAACP was not wild about the youth council. They were kind of, they thought of the youth council as, I mean, this is, I don't even talk about this much because it's difficult to articulate in a way that doesn't, I don't know. So Artie Halyard, who's one of a on the Mount Rushmore of people contributing to the Black community of Milwaukee in the early days, she formed the youth council, and she thought of it as sort of the way to train professionals. So when they started moving into the streets and activism, it ruffled feathers. And I think, yeah, and not that every story doesn't need to have she doesn't become the antagonist by virtue of the fact that she had critique of them. And I think that's what's hard and why I don't talk about it. But that tension between generations doesn't mean that one's totally right and one's totally wrong.
Yeah. And as we think about particularly engaging these topics with predominantly white classrooms and predominantly white educational institutions, I think it would be remiss of us if we did not one more time mention the Wisconsin Historical Society's vast collection on Freedom Summer. And Freedom Summer is still this very important moment in not only the civil rights movement, but in activism more broadly, because of the ways that Black and white student activists come together. They fracture soon after, but there is this sort of rich moment where you have Black and white students who are in the belly of America's race war, and white students and white activists are killed during the 1960s. White students are very valuable in not only highlighting the grotesque nature of American racism in the South, but also the important contribution that whites have made to this broader landscape of equality.
I'm hearing from Command Central. Moving to the
Command
next
Central.
slide.
All right. Okay.